Alright, I think we'll get started. So, what are TAP projects? They are federally funded, community-based projects that expand travel choices, integrate modes, and improve cultural and historic environmental aspects of our transportation infrastructure. They also enhance the transportation experience too. So there's basically 10 project categories that are eligible for TAP funding. These projects can be ped and bike facilities, safe routes for non-drivers, scenic turnouts and overlooks, rails to trails, outdoor advertising management, preservation and rehab of historic transportation facilities, vegetation management, stormwater mitigation, archaeological activities, and wildlife management. So for the first category of ped and bike facilities, some eligible projects can include sidewalks, walkways and curb ramps, bike lane striping, wide paved shoulders, bike parking and bus racks, traffic calming measures, off-road trails, bike ped over and underpasses, and so these projects, they must be ADA compliant.
Participant says there's a lot of background noise, so
So the next category is safe routes for non-drivers. So TAP funding could be used for access accommodation for children, older adults, individuals with disabilities. Some project examples could be sidewalk improvements, traffic calming and speed reduction, on and off street bike and ped facilities. Next category is rails to trails. TAP funding could be used for conversion use of abandoned railroad corridors that can be turned into trails for non-motorized users. So developing railroad trail projects would be eligible. Constructions and major reconstructions of multi-use trails along railroad right-of-ways would also be eligible too. The next category, scenic turnouts and overlooks. Funds may be used for construction of scenic turnouts, overlooks, viewing areas. It's important to know that the TAP funds cannot be used for construction of visitor centers, marketing and promotion, and staffing, operation, maintenance costs of any facilities. And so next category is outdoor advertising management. So this can include inventory control, removal of outdoor advertising. So projects can be billboard inventories that can be done with GIS and GPS, and also removal of illegal and non-conforming billboards. Alright, so we also got historic transportation facilities. TAP funds can be used for restoration and reuse of historic buildings for transportation-related purposes. And also access improvements to historic sites and buildings, interpretive displays at historic sites as well. Restoration projects can be railroad depots, bus stations, lighthouses, and also some rehabilitation projects can be rail trestles, tunnels, bridges, and canals. Vegetation management is the next category. TAP funds can be used for improvement of roadway safety, prevention of invasive species, and providing erosion control. So this could include clearing of low-hanging branches that could be encroaching on a travel corridor, landscaping to help improve sight lines and improve safety, removal of invasive species, and also planting grasses or wildflowers to manage erosion along transportation corridors. All right, next category is archaeological activities, projects related to impacts from implementation of highway construction projects. Some projects can be research, preservation, planning, and interpretation, and development of interpretive signs, exhibits, and guides, and also creating inventories and surveys too. All right, stormwater mitigation, another category. TAP funds can be used for pollution prevention and abatement activities that address stormwater management and water pollution prevention related to highway construction or due to highway runoff. Some examples of some projects can be stream channel stabilization, river cleanups, water pollutions, and storm drain stenciling too. All right, so wildlife management is also another category. This TAP funds can be used for reduction of vehicle-caused wildlife mortality, also restoration to help connect terrestrial and aquatic habitats. And so some examples of some projects can be some wetlands acquisitions and restorations, stream channel stabilization, wildlife under and overpasses, and also monitoring and collecting data on habitat fragmentation and also vehicle-caused wildlife mortality. All right, so some non-eligible projects are scenic easements, also establishment of transportation museums, as well as visitor centers, marketing and promotion plans, interpretive plans, scenic byway corridor management plans, also bike ped safety education programs for adults. However, though, there's activities targeting children in kindergarten through 8th grade that would be eligible under Safe Routes to School. All right, some activities that are not eligible for funding would be administrative costs, such as engineering, right-of-way acquisition, promotional activities, except for what is permitted under Safe Routes to School. Also general recreation, park facilities, playground equipment, sports fields, etc. And also routine maintenance and operations. All right, so the Area Transportation Partnership Involvement is a committee made up of elected officials, engineers, planners, and other administrative people from other agencies as well. And it's basically made up of the counties that you see in green to the right of St. Louis, Itasca, Koochiching County, Cook Lake, Pine, and Carlton. So projects are selected at a regional level through the ATP. TAP Task Force is responsible for development of the TAP program and also ranking of these projects. So our ATP is one. So these projects will be prioritized and will end up in the ATIP. And so the ATIP is a 4-year list of prioritized projects. The ATIP will get submitted to MnDOT and will become eventually part of the STIP. So how much money is available? So approximately $900,000 are available for TAP projects in fiscal year 2019. The minimum request is about $100,000, and also the maximum request is $600,000. Local match requirements: 20% local match is required for state or local funds for TAP projects, which include Safe Routes to School with TAP funds. So eligibility and sponsorship. Any applicant with a sponsor can apply for funding. This can include schools, school districts, scenic byway committees and councils, small cities, townships, and also transit agencies. Sponsors can be state agencies, counties, cities over 5,000, tribal governments, and ARDC. These sponsors are also eligible to sponsor their own project or in other entities as well. So a sponsoring agency must pass a resolution that guarantees project delivery, agrees to maintain the facility, and also not change the use of right of way or property ownership. So you should give your sponsor time to pass the resolution and review material before submitting the application. It'd be a good idea to contact your sponsor before you even submit the letter of intent, so that they're even aware of the project and that support is ensured too. All right, so some federal program requirements must be taken in consideration while in the development and implementation stages. So the Davis-Bacon and Copeland Acts, that is, the payment of predetermined wage is applicable to all federal aid construction contracts exceeding $2,000 and to all related subcontracts. And also ADA requirements that are federally and state mandated, anti-discrimination laws. All projects must be under direct supervision of a Minnesota licensed professional engineer. So additional requirements and specifications may be needed by MnDOT. So how to apply? So the letter of intent should be the first thing that should be completed to begin your eligibility to submit a full TAP application. So an online form for the MnDOT TAP website asks 9 questions that gets the basics of your project. Submission for this LOI will be October 31st and will be reviewed by ARDC, NPO, or District 1. And the review deadline is November 14th. And that's when you'll find out either to be recommended or not to proceed with the full TAP application. So the final application will be made available to eligible TAP applicants. The final application deadline is January 9th, 2015. So the review process, TAP Task Force will meet, discuss, and score these projects. The highest ranked projects will be selected for funding. And the Task Force membership represents representatives from local government, active living, bike and peds, safe routes to school, scenic byways, and paved trails. All right, so and also the Regional Transportation Advisory Committee, the RTAC, which meets quarterly, will meet in March to review these prioritized TAP projects. As well, the ATP will meet in April to review and approve these TAP projects to be included in the ATIP. And then the ATIP, like I said earlier, will be submitted to MnDOT and will be included into the STIP. So successful and unsuccessful applicants will be notified by April 15th, 2015. So that's when you should find out. And here's an overview of the key dates. Hopefully it's not too hard to see, but this presentation will be online so everyone can get this. So October 1st, like I said, will be the official opening of the solicitation and call for letters. October 31st will be the deadline to submit the LOI. November 14th will be the deadline for review of those LOIs, and the notice will be given to proceed with the full TAP application. And January 9th, as I said, is the key date. That's the deadline to submit the full TAP application. And April 15th will be the deadline for the ATP to select TAP projects to be included into the STIP. So some important resources, the Northeast Minnesota ATP website, which I said I'll post this presentation, and this will also have more information as far as TAP guidance for what MnDOT sent us as well. And the MnDOT TAP website also where you can find the LOI and eventually the TAP full application. So is there any questions? Please type down your questions if you have any.
There's one question that was typed earlier. Can funds be used to purchase abandoned railroad?
Well, I believe so. From what MnDOT sent us for that, it didn't say directly, but looks like in the past that they did. So I'll have to follow up on that to be for certain, and I'll get back to you about that, Troy. Anything else? Okay, so here's my contact information. If you have any more questions, I can be able to hopefully answer them for you. And so I'll be handing over this part of the presentation to Walter. He'll be talking about project management.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to give, I think, our participants a little bit of a dose of reality now. And what I'm talking about is the part where actually your project was selected by the ATP, and you have a letter saying your project is funded and the level of federal funds that are available for your project. So, and this is kind of a gut check for everybody in terms of, you know, what the requirements are for using the TAP funds, because they are federal funds. They're basically come out of set aside, you know, from the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So these are the same kinds of federal gas taxes. Pardon?
Oh, big project, huh? Yeah.
So these are the same kinds of projects that the same funding that MnDOT uses, like on the trunk highway system, on the interstate system, you know, for, you know, multi-million-dollar projects. So, so there's a lot of rules and regulations associated with using these funds, and unfortunately, it can be quite a bit to bite off for a small agency. Typically, when they talk about a project sponsor, again, that's a county, city over 5,000, another state agency, is because these are the only agencies that are qualified to receive the federal highway funds. They're the ones that have to provide and ensure the oversight for the entire project. So that's why you'll see the how important the project sponsor is. I want to talk a little bit about eligibility. You know, FHWA does review our recommendations to ensure that the TAP funds and the TAP projects are expended according to the rules and regulations outlined for that program. And I can't emphasize more the second line here, in that the transportation alternative funds are not for recreational projects. And a lot of times we'll see applications coming in for what looks like a recreational trail or something like that. And those projects aren't eligible. If you've looked at all the different categories, they're all sort of alternate transportation related. Okay, they have to have the component relating back to make a transportation connection. So it's either a mode of transportation that you could take instead of getting in your car and driving, or some other improvement or enhancement to a transportation facility. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. So if you're thinking about your project is more recreational in nature, then there might be some other programs that would be available for that type of project, but not the TAP funds. Again, I think I mentioned this, the transportation alternatives, they're part of the Title 23 federal funds. They're the fuel taxes. They must follow all the federal environmental design, construction, inspection, and rules and laws as if the project were actually a major highway or bridge. So whether this is a $100,000 project or a $10 million trunk highway project, you basically have to follow the same rules and regulations. It doesn't seem fair, but those are the requirements. You know, your project manager, the sponsor, I mean, you're going to have somebody at the local level that is going to manage the project. Typically for a small city or a township or a school or even some counties, they will look to the consulting engineering community to help them as far as their project manager. And he must perform miracles. And again, he won't be paid for with transportation alternative funds. If you looked at Jared's previous slides there, they said that engineering and right-of-way and a lot of these other costs of your project aren't eligible for the transportation alternative funding. Basically, the transportation alternatives are for the nuts and bolts of the project, and then only 80% of the eligible nuts and bolts. And so when you're looking at the total project costs, you know, you will find that the Transportation Alternatives Program might only fund 50 or 60% of the total project cost. So that's something to keep in mind. The kind of the basic steps that you would have in a transportation alternative project is kind of falls into these 5 categories. And one of those, and probably the most important one, is scoping out the project and getting that, the total idea for your project pretty well defined. And once you have that, you can concentrate on the environmental documents, the National Environmental Protection Act, and kind of go through what we call a draft project memo. That's kind of the lowest form of environmental documentation required for a relatively simple project. And once you've identified basically the least environmental path for your project, you would then get to another phase where you had a little bit more preliminary engineering plans, the final memo, project memo, the final environmental document, and then working on any permits that you might require. You know, if you're affecting wetlands, it could be a Corps of Engineers permit or a wetlands permit or a stream crossing or culverts, you know, or an MPCA permit, you know, because you're increasing the impervious surface in an area, and so you need, you know, a permit from a stormwater permit from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Then you would probably develop your final plans. You would have to make sure you had all the right-of-way. You would then be authorized for a project letting. And then once your project is let and awarded, you would get into the construction of the actual project and actually finaling out the project. And I'll go into each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. Basically, the project scoping is you're meeting with your designers, the project sponsors, which could be a county or city or another state agency, really trying to involve any of the adjacent landowners and any person or agency that may be affected by the project. You know, you might want to, you know, if you needed a permit, you might want to have early contact with those permitting agencies, these kinds of things, so that you can kind of maybe identify a project that would have initially the least impact and acceptable basically to the adjacent landowners. We've had many times where a project has gotten down to the final stages and, you know, individual landowners that the trail was going by or whatever, you know, haven't really been kept informed about the project. and basically can put up enough resistance, that the project failed to be constructed. So that's the time to kind of hammer out all these little project details, what the alignments are or what the type of the project is, costs, anticipated environmental impacts, different alternatives, these kinds of things. So you can see that the project scoping and involving as many people as possible in that scope so that they're aware of the project is very important. Now, when we talk about the project memo, and again, this is the simplest form of environmental documentation, is there's lots of impacts that you have to address, and impacts that kind of most people don't think about. And basically, that's the social, economic, and environmental impacts, and what we call the 4F and 6F thing. So if there's a park or a recreational area, and a lot of times there is, because you're looking at maybe making a trail connection, from one part of town or whatever, to parks or recreational areas or whatever, and maybe that park or recreational area was constructed with other federal funds under another federal program. Having that 4F and 6F review by those other federal agencies can be very time consuming. And if you're using any right-of-way or impacting, any of the property that are on those types of facilities, again, that quite a complex process to go through those approvals. The other thing that kind of it really holds up a lot of projects is the National Historic Preservation Act. And a lot of times you'll hear Section 106. I mean, this is kind of a standard term people talk about, but that's kind of what effect your project might have on historic character even of the area. And by historic character, they kind of, the cultural resources folks look at basically any kind of structure or facility that's 50 years old or older. It's kind of interesting because I qualify as a historic facility myself. So, I mean, you don't think 50 years old as being actually that old, but they do actually, your project has to review kind of against that age standard. And one of these, one example I like to go to is in the city of Chisholm. They had a transportation alternative project, for a streetscape. So they had street lights and these kinds of things in downtown Chisholm. And they wanted to have, certain type of curb and certain type of tree grates and these kinds of things. And the historic character of Chisholm in the past was it was kind of a wild mining town and had a lot of taverns and facilities like that. And for the most part, either had concrete sidewalks or wooden sidewalks. And so the historic cultural resources people said, well, you can't have any of these fancy kinds of sidewalks on this type of project because that's against the historic character, of the nature of the street. So they really had to kind of redesign what they wanted so that it didn't have any negative impact for cultural resources. And if you have to mitigate some of the cultural resources, the length of time can be quite long in terms of finding out what the mitigation might be and getting that Section 106, the historic preservation approval, having that letter of no findings type of thing for your project. So again, those two top ones can affect the project timing a lot. Again, you have to review your project for endangered or threatened species, whether that would have a negative impact on any of those. I mean, we have a number of endangered plants, and so even if you're going through a wooded area, maybe with a trail or some other impact where, you're going through an area that hadn't been previously disturbed or whatever, there could be some endangered or protected plant species, or animals or birds, those kinds of things. So that all has to be reviewed. The right-of-way, again, and that's not eligible for the TAP funding, but you have to determine if your project needs any right-of-way. If it does need right-of-way, does it impact, any unique farmland? Basically, does that right-of-way that you're purchasing, does it have any contaminated soils on it? A lot of times people will, not think about it, but maybe at one time there was an old gas station there, an old dry cleaning place or whatever. And so if you're going to do any excavation as part of your project, and you went in there, you're going to have to at least do a cursory review of if there's going to be any contaminated soils in that area. And if there's a high probability of that, you're going to have to do more investigation and maybe have that treatment as part of your project. So again, that's something that most people don't think about, and something that you might want to think about when you're actually doing your project scoping. Air quality normally isn't a big factor for transportation alternative program projects because they're typically not very large projects. And it goes on. Your project is going to have a noise impact just from the construction equipment itself, typically, and so that has to be addressed and minimized. Again, if you're impacting wetlands to such an extent that you need a Corps of Engineers permit, typically, if you need an individual permit for your project, you're probably looking at least 2 years of lead time in order to get that permit. A lot of times, if we have trails, and a lot of times they follow, kind of drainage areas or whatever, and you have to determine if your project would negatively impact a floodplain, if it increases some runoff in a floodplain area, or if it would be subject to periodic flooding, those kinds of things. Wetlands, it goes hand in hand either with the Corps of Engineers or Minnesota's Wetland Conservation Act. And typically, the sponsoring agency or whatever will have some provisions or whatever for mitigating some of the wetlands. One example we had here, a project in Two Harbors that was quite surprising when they actually determined the wetland impacts for the Corps permit. They found that the mitigation cost for the wetlands to buy credits is over $70,000. And that was really a high unexpected cost. And again, purchasing those wetland credits for those wetland impacts is not eligible for the TAP fund. So again, I caution everybody to look at your total project costs and then look at what costs are eligible actually for the TAP funds. And myself, I'm available to answer any of those questions, or if you contact Jarrett too, if you have questions about eligibility, certainly contact us. Public waters, the DNR permit, I mentioned hazardous waste sites, and then any mitigations of whatever damages that your project might cause to adjacent properties or to the environment. We're not quite done yet. You have to address if there's any controversial issues with your project. You might have a trail where you have one group that's opposed to the project, and maybe a larger group that is in favor of it. And so you have to, through a public hearing process or whatever, identify, the questions that arose, whatever controversy is part of the project and how it was addressed in the final design. Aesthetic values, how, your project would affect its surroundings. You might have to mitigate traffic during construction. One of the things that normally isn't considered, but maybe your project is adjacent to a regular street, and for construction equipment and for actually constructing a project, you might have to detour traffic. You might have to restrict traffic movements, those kinds of things, and that has to be addressed. Having a state environmental review, those are typically larger projects than what we would see, and very rarely have we had those requirements come into play. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Environmental justice is, we have there's protected class groups within our area here. Typically they're in the larger cities and those kinds of things, and you want to make sure that your project doesn't adversely impact any of the protected groups within our area. And then after a lot of those are addressed, then you actually get a federal action determination statement. And what you're really looking for in your environmental document is those magic words that say finding of no significant impact, and hopefully that's what we arrive at. And so that now we're kind of talking about that environmental document, but then when we're done with a lot of the preliminary of the environmental document, there's also the actual design. And because these are federal highway funds, there are certain design standards. If it's a trail project, it has to has to meet, a certain width. It can't be more than a certain, vertical grade. It can't be too steep. When we talk about the ADA, the Americans for Disability Act, it has to meet all the requirements, for the wheelchair access, for impaired visibility, those kinds of things, impaired hearing type of things. So a lot of the times the ADA requirements on a project can be quite expensive if you're going through an urban area and you're thinking about all the kinds of ramps and the kinds of grades and the kinds of accommodation that must be made to meet the requirements of the ADA. And those are federal requirements, and they normally can't be waived. Then we have the plans and specifications. We finally determined, what part of this project, what nuts and bolts in this project are eligible for federal participation. Again, the federal part of the project for the TAP funds, is going to be competitively bid. And no proprietary items. You can't say, well, I want this kind of lamppost, or I want this, type of concrete or whatever. There have to be basically general specifications or specifications that show at least 3 or more comparable types of materials or workmanship, those kinds of things. So, all of that is federal to be eligible for federal participation. You're still looking at other alternatives that may have less impact when you get into final design, and you actually might have to, find out if you can't get right of way or something, you've got to make a change in your plan. Then you have to actually go back and modify your environmental document to include those changes. So, a fairly complex process. Once you have that, actually, plan approvals will go through my office, which I'll review to make sure that you do meet all those rules, regulations, and requirements. You'll have to prove to me that you have all the right-of-way, certify that all the right-of-way has been acquired, that you've contacted any utilities. There could be telephone or fiber optic or electric utilities or those kinds of things, and all those companies need to be identified and find out if any of those utilities are impacted by your project. The interesting thing is if you have to move some of those utilities or whatever, and to pay for moving those utilities is a local cost. Moving those utilities is not eligible for the TAP funding. Finally, you get a good engineer's estimate. Hopefully it was fairly close to what you were projecting when you submitted your final application, because once you receive your letter of funding, that level of federal funds are capped. And so what that means is if your project bids come in and it's over that federal amount or whatever, any of those additional costs are the local responsibility. Okay. The maximum amount the federal would cover, would be 80% of the eligible. If your project and also capped at the amount that was approved in the State Transportation Improvement Plan, that STIP. So if your project was a $300,000 project with federal funds and it came in at $500,000, you would have to cover that difference. If you had changes in the contract during the construction that increased the price of the contract, those overruns would be, again, the local responsibility. So there's some things really to keep in mind. You'll eventually have a bid letting, and the bid itself, the contract itself, will be held by your project sponsor. So if you're a small city or you're a township or whatever, you're not going to be owner of that contract. The contract is going to be the county or city over 5,000. And so they're going to have to administer that because, again, they're the ones that have the ability to receive the federal funds. Then you go through an award process and you actually get down to the actual construction. And again, it has to be supervised by a professional engineer, and or certified inspectors. Again, these are federal funds, and so we have to make sure all the materials and workmanship meet the plans and specifications. And we do that through a process of having professional engineers and certified inspectors on the project. And again, that does cost money. And again, those funds and that cost is not eligible for the TAP funding. Okay, typically, who's your agency? You know, it's going to be a county or a city over 5,000. They'll normally have an agreement that outline what their responsibilities are and what your responsibilities are. Typically, your agency would want the 20% match, or if it's more than the 20% match, you know, up front, because, I mean, they're the ones that are going to be making payments to the contractors. And so a lot of times they want your match, you know, in the bank before they make payments to the contractor, because that your sponsoring agency, they're the ones that writes the checks. And it's interesting in that the federal funds, a lot of times it'll say as a grant, or you received a TAP grant for this amount of money, and it's really not a grant per se in where the county or the city or your sponsoring agency, you know, gets the money up front. It's a reimbursement process. In fact, the sponsoring agency will have to make a payment to the contractor, then request the federal eligible share through the state of Minnesota. So there's always a lag time. So whoever that sponsoring agency is, they're basically is going to be the banker for the project, and it's a reimbursement basis. A word about when you should have started. It's interesting because we're soliciting projects for the federal fiscal year 2019. However, you may already be behind schedule. And if you kind of paid attention during my presentation, you can see that, you know, if you need a core permit and it's a couple years down the line to get a core permit, that, yeah, unless you've got a pretty good project scope or whatever, you already could be behind schedule. And that's why I say that early contact with the public, state and federal agencies, and working with your project sponsor, typically they already have had experience of their own using federal funds. They could really, you know, be your best sources of information. The other thing that the flip side of that is, if you have done a lot of work and your project is fairly simple, and you might be able to have your project completed earlier than 2019. There is a lot of times there's opportunities for your project to be advanced because some other project has missed the deadlines, and so there's always an incentive to complete your project early if you can. This is just kind of a guideline, and basically that project memo, the simplest environmental document possible for a project, will take 6 months. And the interesting part of this is the, you know, a lot of times you have to do the review if there's wetlands or if there's plant species or these kinds of things. They all have to be accomplished during the growing season. And for us, you know, 6 months, maybe less. It seems like this year our growing season is less than that. You know, probably maybe only 4 months of actual time that you can go out there and identify, you know, wetland plants or protected plants or these kinds of things. So if you've missed a season of reviewing this, you know, you've already lost a year. So, you know, so your project manager scheduling, doing that critical path scheduling of your project is critical, because you can only do a lot of this environmental review in our growing season. You need to have an opportunity for a public hearing. Again, there might be some controversial issues, these things. Basically, the fastest I've ever seen plans and specifications and our approvals through our offices for those is typically 6 months. Right of way, you know, if you have to negotiate with landowners, have to get appraisals, those kinds of things. I mean, that typically can take over a year or longer. And again, if you need a core permit, that's 2 years. If you need other permits, authorization letting, an additional 12 months. So you add all this up, and depending on your project, you could already be over 4 years in the making. You know, it's interesting, a typical county project, you know, that needs a core permit or whatever, you know, they're typically at least 4 or 5 years in the planning process from, you know, from the project initiation to actually getting it under construction. So it seems very unreasonable, but this is the reality of what we have to work with today. Once your project is complete, you know, I will have to do a final project inspection, make sure it was actually constructed according to the plans and specifications. All the materials on the project will have to be certified that they met the inspection or the requirements of the materials in the specifications. And again, you know, that's the responsibility of those certified inspectors, the certified materials testers that are on the project. And again, those tests are going to have to be made. They're required and to receive the federal funds. And a lot of that testing is not cheap. Have to make final payment to the contractor, and then basically the agency that owns the facility has to assure that you're actually going to maintain this facility for what we would determine the life. So if it was a trail, we'd say it has a reasonable life expectancy of 15 years. So you would have to have a program in place or whatever to have maintenance of that facility for 15 years or something like that. You know, again, it's going to take some routine maintenance, you know, whether it's sweeping or vegetation control or, you know, filling cracks or those kinds of things. You know, the local agency or the agency that owns this facility is going to have to make sure that there is some maintenance plan in effect to be able to keep it in good condition. And I've got my contact information here and the phone number there. Your agency sponsor, again, is a good contact to call, whether it's a county or a city over 5,000. My name and number is there. I can answer questions on any of the project details, any design standards, whatever project documentation, or just about anything else. I've been in this business for over 30 years, so you know, I've probably done it or seen it all. So online, there's state aid project documentation manuals. If you decide to have a consulting engineering firm help you with your project, most of them are pretty aware of where, you know, the requirements for your project. And I probably, if they're local, I probably worked with them many times over the years. We have a special projects, federal projects coordinator in St. Paul. After I review a project, it gets a final review from Lynette Rochelle, and her number is there. And basically, Lynette would be a resource that we would go to if we couldn't answer any of your questions locally. Then we go to our St. Paul expert, and that's Lynette. I see we had a question about slide 41, and that was opportunity for public hearing. And it's not necessarily always required. Typically, you do have an opportunity notice for the public, and if you don't, if you don't get a lot of response for the opportunity, you don't necessarily have to hold it. But we've found in the past that that having a public hearing on a project or whatever, certainly in that development phase, where you're scoping the project out and you're getting ideas or whatever, if you've had that opportunity and you've gotten that input, makes for a much better project, and identifies if there is going to be any controversial issues, because if it comes to the last part of submitting your plans and getting approvals and getting the project ready for advertising for bid, and people come out and this is the first they've heard of the project and it's kind of not in my backyard or whatever, they've been able to delay the project such that the federal funds were no longer available. Basically, our rule of thumb, if you can't meet the project deadlines for the 2019 federal funds, it's kind of you might have an opportunity to extend it. However, chances are you would actually lose the federal funds even after going through all that work. So it's important not to have any surprises with your project at the last minute. These are just a few examples that I have of some previous enhancement projects. And, this is a historic site just off of SCENIC 61 in St. Louis County. And many of you probably drove through that. And again, this is restoration of of an historic site next to County 61. There's a number of trails and trail systems in Two Harbors that the city of Two Harbors has been successful through their sponsor, which is Lake County Highway Department. For trails, trails off the county road or parallel to the county road. This is a trail connection, basically from Carlton that will eventually, hopefully, get into the city of Cloquet. Again, it's off-highway trail that parallels, in this case, parallels Trunk Highway 45. We have a lot of projects, obviously, on the Lake Walk and the Cross City Trail, and trying to connect the Munger Trail to the Lake Walk system to Brighton Beach. And so there's a number of projects that we've done successfully to make those connections. We've done some restorations of historic locomotives and and their display areas. We've done a restoration that's kind of this is on Forest Highway 11 in Lake County, and kind of the old Toymie School, and it's also a rest area stop and on a scenic byway. We did a restoration of the Two Harbors Lighthouse, and that's an example of restoring a historic transportation facility. And this would be an example of like a streetscape. Typically, we look if the owner of the street, whether it's a city or a county, and they're looking at rehabbing the street, a lot of times they would enhance that overall project by maybe adding TAP funds, to add some amenities to the project itself.
Okay, so that's that, and now the next part is the Safe Routes to School infrastructure grant solicitation preview.
Jared, I just have one
Yes.
one thing to mention, and I know a lot of this is, if it's new to you and if you haven't seen this before, could be maybe a little bit confusing, and that's why we've gone to the two-part application process. So when you look at that expression of interest application, that's where we get a kind of an idea of what the project you're thinking of, and then that gives us an opportunity to comment on that, on eligibility, or what we would think would be eligible for federal funds or what wouldn't be eligible for federal funds, or what the complexity of that project would be. And before you've spent a lot of time on a formal application, kind of looking at that level of interest first application, and that's a big help.
All right, thank you, Walter. All right, so for the Safe Routes to School grant, infrastructure grant solicitation preview. So this is a state program. There's $1 million available in state funds for infrastructure projects that'll be ready for construction in 2015 or 2016. So projects need to be located within 2 miles of a K through 12 school. A state aid city or county is required as a sponsor. Townships and cities that have less than 5,000 people must contact the county to be a project sponsor. So awarded applicants, then they will have to work out a grant agreement with MnDOT. All right, so eligible applicants, they could be public and private schools, school districts, cities, counties, tribal governments, and townships. These entities must submit an application with a state aid sponsor. So as mentioned, a state aid city or county sponsor is required for all infrastructure projects. If a city in which the project is taking place is not listed as a state aid city, then that city must work with the county as a sponsor then. So the sponsor's task can include being the fiscal agent, ensuring that the project meets its deadlines, milestones, and dates, execute a grant agreement, and develop and submit plans, also submit pay requests, and provide progress reports or updates with the district engineer as well as the state aid programs engineer, as well as assist with the project closeout. Alright, so some eligible projects can be sidewalk improvements, traffic calming and speed reduction improvements, bike and ped crossing, often off-street bike and ped facilities, bike parking facilities, and also some traffic diversion improvements as well. It's also important to note that electronic devices, like signs or anything, must be permanent and not mobile. So projects already funded or identified in the STIP will not be eligible for this round of solicitation. So for the selection criteria, Safe Routes to School Steering Committee will review projects with the criteria in mind that improves bike and ped safety and encourages a non-motorized transportation to and from school. And there's project support either with school resolution and by state aid, city council, or county board resolution. And also that the project is ready to go too. And geographical distribution will be a key factor as well. So scoring and rankings will be done by a separate group and as well as ATP. So some requirements. Plans must be prepared under supervision, local public engineer, or with an agreement with a consultant or with another public agency. Railroad grade crossing info must be provided if there's a railroad within the project limits or close to its termini. And also another requirement is use of the latest approved MnDOT standard specifications for construction and any other supplemental specifications. So as mentioned earlier, there is $1 million available in state funds. MnDOT prefers that applicants apply for projects that are about $100,000 or higher. You should keep in mind cost estimates should be taken into consideration for 2015-2016 letting. There is no local match, but however, though, state funds can only be used to fund construction costs. So engineering and project design will be a local responsibility. So the solicitation schedule is almost pretty much online with the TAP solicitation. So the solicitation notice is October of 2014. Application deadline will be January of 2015. Most likely that'll be the same deadline as the TAP application. There will be committee review, will be in 2015, and then you hear an announcement of an award in March of 2015 as well. So exact dates have not yet been determined by MnDOT, but that should be coming out hopefully pretty soon. Alright, so applications will be made available from the MnDOT Safe Routes to School website by October 8th. So it's an important date, and there will be a great resource to find also some information about exact dates as well too. They'll be coming up. So is there any other questions?
Jared, I just want to add that under the Safe Routes to School program, the key for our participants to understand is the Safe Routes to School program that was presented there are just state funds.
Yes.
Okay, so they don't have the federal fund component on it. So it's a much simpler process for the review. The environmental process, typically there is no environmental document. You will have to follow the American for Disabilities Act requirements, the ADA requirements, because those have been adopted by Minnesota for using even state funds. So the process is plan refuels, the standards, a lot of those things are the same. However, we don't have the federal fund component involved in it. And so it's probably about 40% less paperwork than the TAP program in terms of requirements.
All right, so that is it for this workshop. And like I said, this will be made available online for your reference at the Northeast Minnesota ATP website. And it is also for the Safe Routes to School part of that. I will post this Safe Routes to School portion of it on there too. So thank you all for attending, and hopefully to hear from your projects soon. Thank you.
That's fine, because hopefully you've seen my telephone number up there or Garrett's telephone number, and yeah, if you want to call, we can probably be able to answer, your question just via a phone call. So.
Yeah, if we did the count, it'd actually be 6-2. Few bikes. So people are, and you were at 19th Street. Were you up closer to? Okay. Right. Correct. That worked really well. Yeah. Well, if we get enough volunteers, which I'll forward this email to you.